Okay, let's take a closer look now at some of the key characteristics and structural components of ecosystems in the business context. We'll start by looking at ecosystem participants. What kinds of groups and individuals are actually involved in an ecosystem, in contradistinction or in contrast to the traditional view of industries and markets. Well, first of all, we have producers. These constitute the supply side of the ecosystem by creating and providing goods and services which are exchanged with other ecosystem participants. Note here, not necessarily customers. Rival producers are competitors to a producer's own offering. Of course, it was the case in the traditional view as well. But the most important point to bear in mind here is that producers are not necessarily always going to be looking or geared towards selling to customers. We're going to see that the modern business ecosystem is a little bit more complex and nuanced than that. Then you have regulators and government bodies and other agencies, for example, government regulators, trade unions, certification agencies, which might not necessarily actually be government agencies, but might be independent private agencies, policymakers, and consumer associations. These stakeholder groups set the governing rules, standards, and frameworks of the overall ecosystem. So these are not necessarily just regulators, but these are groups that define the standards and the kinds of guidelines, recommendations, and the structure and the way that people behave within, the values within a particular ecosystem. So they set the overall framework and culture of the ecosystem. The next group then is what is called orchestrators. The groups driving the coordination, configuration, and management of stakeholder interactions and the structure of an ecosystem environment. The important role that the orchestrator plays in ecosystem environments will be explained in a little bit more detail later on. Then we have infrastructure suppliers. Suppliers of the technical infrastructure needed to support and maintain, in particular, digital platforms, which we'll discuss a little bit later on as well, which allow ecosystems to flourish. Suppliers provide communication and IT systems and systems development expertise as well. Really, the modern ecosystem has coincided with the advent and emergence of information technologies, particularly the internet, wireless technologies, cloud technologies, and so on. And that is really, really important for supplying the infrastructure for these very dynamic kinds of environments, much less linear than the previous traditional market view. And then finally, of course, you still have those consumers within the industry. They represent the demand side, of course, of this ecosystem environment, purchasing the goods and services produced by suppliers to the ecosystem. So it's important really to bear in mind that we're not dealing with the traditional linear set of relationships here. There's a much more dynamic interplay of forces going on in the ecosystem in contrast to the traditional market view. So you can see here the relationships, for example, often work both ways. You will have producers and government bodies and regulators interacting often in dynamic ways, not just the government bodies and regulators and certification agencies and so on actually dictating terms to the producers, but producers working in the other direction as well. You might have infrastructure suppliers working with governments, governments with infrastructure suppliers, orchestrators with consumers, consumers with producers, producers with other producers, and so on and so forth. So you have to bear that in mind with this ecosystem idea. We're dealing with a very complicated and collaborative interactive network amongst all of the various participants. So think about it in a network sense rather than in a linear sense. The traditional structure and the traditional view of the market was much more linear. We were going from the suppliers, distributors, to the producers, to the sellers, to the customer. But here we're dealing with a much more complex web, lots of feedbacks, two-way feedbacks between the various participants within an ecosystem. Let's look at another example or illustration now, just to give you a sense of some of those participants in a real-world example of an ecosystem. We're looking here at the transport or mobility ecosystem, and especially the advent or the coming advent of self-driving vehicles. So, for example, you will have, of course, the manufacturers of the self-driving vehicles. You have companies like Google who are getting involved in this. And then you have other related companies like Uber, for example. They might not necessarily be directly involved, but they're certainly very interested. They have been involved, for example, in sponsoring some of these initiatives. And of course, from their point of view, this is a very interesting development because, of course, it might completely revolutionize the taxi cab industry and the ride-sharing industry. If you can get a self-driving car, it would be a much different kind of industry for Uber then as well when it comes to what they do, bringing drivers and travelers together. Of course, if there's no driver involved, then that's going to have a huge influence on the cost structure of that particular company. You've also got then urban planners and government agents working on urban planning. This could be potentially revolutionary from their point of view, having just self-driving cars going around in city locations instead of people in cars looking for parking spaces and things like that. If you have self-driving cars, it totally changes everything. You could have, for example, the car bring you into your workplace in an urban location, and the car then drives itself back to your home and then comes and picks you up when you're ready to go home from work. So things like parking lots and parking spaces may no longer be as necessary in this kind of ecosystem. So you're going to have potential for collaboration, communication, idea sharing amongst these three different participants. And then, of course, you have car insurance companies. The whole insurance industry stands to be potentially revolutionized as well by this particular technology. And so you're going to have a huge degree potentially of collaboration and idea sharing, again, amongst things like government bodies, urban planners, and companies that are actually developing these self-driving vehicles, like Google, for instance. And so you have this huge complex network within this ecosystem. This is not simply a linear thing of going from buyer to seller, going from producer, manufacturer to distributor to customer. We're looking at a whole web of independent subsystems within this ecosystem. Uber is its own whole little world, and yet it is overlapping potentially with self-driving vehicles, with urban planners, with car insurance companies, and so on and so forth. So who exactly is who in this context, in this ecosystem, based on those previous categories and participants that we've just been looking at? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Where do these various parties or participants fit? The self-driving car manufacturers, Uber, for example, the urban planners and the government urban planners in the bottom left segment, and those car insurance companies as well. What kinds of participants are they? I'll give you a moment to think about that. You can go back to the previous slides and have a look at those different participants and then decide for yourself where these various examples fit into that scheme. Okay, so if you said that the self-driving car manufacturers are producers, then of course you were right. That was probably one of the easier ones. What about Uber then? Well, Uber is one of those infrastructure suppliers. They're supplying a digital network and platform and interface where potentially those self-driving cars can be connected up with people looking to get to various locations. What about urban planners? Well, they fall into that category of regulators, governing bodies, because they set the framework. They're going to be setting some really, really important ground rules and so on and so forth for these self-driving cars, where they can go, where they can't go, what they can do on the roads, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you have the car insurance, and they are also going to fall into that category of regulators, government bodies, and so on, because they are, after all, setting some of those key frameworks, standards, and guidelines. They're going to say that certain things can't be done, certain things will and won't be covered by insurance, and so on and so forth. So there's just one example of an ecosystem and the kinds of participants that are involved.